This is Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. We've got a very interesting show for you today focused on dynamic power, which corresponds to Chapter 9 in our book.
Yeah, that just the title I'm thinking is impressive.
I'm feeling more alert already.
Dynamic power. Yeah, I love the initial quote that we use at the beginning of this book, and it's not by us. But it's by Milton Erickson. He was considered to be the father of hypnotherapy, and he basically said in one of his lectures, most people walk through the world in a trance of disempowerment.
I would bet big money that he had no idea he was giving birth to the zombie movement. I mean, that's basically what zombies are. They're sleepwalking. They're not really fully alive.
Well, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I guess the question is, how often do we realize that we may be sleepwalking through life, or at least acting as if we have no power?
Well, and the sad thing is, a lot of that urge to have an extraordinary life is satisfied watching movies, watching other people have extraordinary experiences.
Yeah, well, so as we get into this topic of dynamic power, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is the blame game, how that often gets played, talking about what we call the power scale and how people can really start to pay attention and notice where are they on the power scale in terms of disempowered or fully empowered.
Right, so really this show is all about empowerment, and kind of the flip side of Erickson's quote there. If we were to shift out of that trance of disempowerment, what would that be like? So that's what we're going to explore.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that gets tricky, we share a story in the very first part of Chapter 9 where we're talking about dynamic power, about a woman who, we called her Melanie in the book. That wasn't her name, but we won't reveal her real name, Will.
Absolutely. The truth is protected on this program.
So, or at least anonymity.
Yeah, let's not exaggerate.
So, what happened in this story? And I was very familiar with this circumstance. So, this organization that she belonged to was planning a day-long celebration. And they had all these events planned, and she got really psyched on the idea of having, at the end of day 2, I think it was, a closing concert. Was somebody who wasn't particularly well known, but that she really liked. Right. And her team kind of hesitated, and she wasn't really reading, the body language and the facial expressions too much, because she was so determined to get this happening. And so they kind of started speaking up, going, well, we're kind of over-programmed, and no, this is a great idea, it's going to happen. So nobody really wanted to fight with her. So they backed down and allowed this to happen.
Well, now, would you say this is a version of brain blindness that she was experiencing? She just couldn't really see what was...
That's a great way to describe it. I hadn't thought of it. I guess her bias toward wanting this thing to happen, and the halo effect maybe she had on this artist that she thought was so great that, she couldn't see or hear, was unwilling to see or hear at least the objections of her partners. Now, to their point, in the aftermath, they realized they didn't express a strong enough objection either.
Well, but this often happens. You see it played out in stories of one kind or another, where someone's all lit up with something. They're so enthused about it. The phrase I always enjoy hearing is, it's going to be great. And of course, that's the sure signal that things are going to go off the rails.
Well, and in this case, it was, people used the other phrase, well, we didn't want to rain on her parade, Well, you can probably guess from what we're describing now.
We've given enough tips here, enough clues.
That as the event came to a very successful conclusion short of the concert, everybody was pretty much exhausted and done and happy. And most of the attendees and a lot of the team went home, leaving Melanie and her artist almost solo for the concert that turned out to be a total bust.
I feel the pain.
Oh, man. I mean, it just utterly bombed. And so, her reaction, she was furious. And she went into the meeting, the follow-up meeting after the event, just livid, and said, I can't believe you set me up to fail. I can't believe you abandoned me.
So she blamed her team.
Yes. Now, one could say, well, they didn't speak up, they didn't show up, there were a lot of things they didn't do. But by doing that, if we left it at that, she would learn nothing
Right.
other than the fact that people let you down.
Right.
Which was, by the way, not surprisingly, one of the stories that ran around in her life.
So she'd had that happen before.
Yes, people let you down.
Mhm.
And she was, she really wanted to have this be kind of proof of how great she was. And yet, once again, the
Yeah.
story came around.
Well, so regular listeners will recognize this theme. We've talked quite a bit about the facts and the stories we tell about the facts. So she has kind of a series going.
Yes,
She has her own little series.
An
like,
episodic.
she has an episodic going where people let her down, where things don't go as well as she hoped.
Yeah, and how often do we do that? I mean, I've shared and you shared our own episodics that we've had in our life.
Well, the ones we don't feel too embarrassed to share, right?
Exactly. And as I was going through this story in preparation for today's program, you and I were also working on a blog that was posted today around this same topic, and it reminded me of a story I heard, or actually a saying that I heard when I was probably maybe 12 or 13. And I had a friend in the neighborhood who was Native American, and towards the end of school year, his grandfather would come up and visit and actually take him home to the Navajo Nation where the rest of the family was. And I was sitting at my friend's house and I was complaining about the situation that had happened and how unfair it was, and I was really frustrated about something that had happened at school. And his grandfather, who rarely said anything, was sitting across the living room, apparently carefully listening to this whole thing, and he uttered some of the first words I'd ever heard him speak. He said, "Life is kind. It will bring you back your lessons over and over again until you finally learn them."
Oh, that is real wisdom.
And at the time, I was kind of like looking at him like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Life is kind?
Wow.
But, it really stuck with me. Clearly,
Yeah.
I still remember it to this day. But as I went home and started to really let what he said sink in, that life was kind in that it allowed these episodics, these lessons to play out over and over again until we finally realize that we're the ones in charge of changing the episode.
Right. So if something shows up, it's because there's a lesson in it.
Yeah. I mean, that's, somebody could say, well, that's just, positive thinking. Well, it might be, but it so happens that when we reframe our life and take charge of how we reframe our life, we get a chance to dramatically impact the outcome.
Well, so what happened with Melanie? How did she take this? I mean, you knew her. So
yeah.
what actually went down?
Well, there was attempts to have people fired.
Over this concert bombing? Oh my God.
It got really difficult. And, I was invited by someone else. I thought it would be a great idea if she got some coaching. Isn't it wonderful how people offer coaching up for other people?
She really needs your coaching.
Yeah. And I said, well, that's going to be something that she's either A, going to have to ask for herself or be willing to receive. How about you? Would you like to see the role you played in this? And so I did end up coaching the team, the rest of the team. She was too angry to really want to be involved. And just talked with them about what could they have done differently?
Right.
What was it? They decided to stay in their comfort zone and not really, challenge her idea. And that they were, in fact, they had their own ownership, their own part of responsibility for this. And I think it was hugely beneficial for them to hear this and realize it.
Well, you were enacting a ritual that's so seldom enacted in our culture, which is to actually learn something from history. I forget who said it. They said the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And that's sadly true.
Yeah,
we can see all the episodics going on in our culture, politically, economically, socially, where what you did, that simple act of reviewing what had happened, and I'm assuming without blame on your part,
Right.
and you were showing them how to just look at what happened. Wow, imagine if that was done more regularly.
Well, wouldn't that be amazing? I mean,
Yeah,
on,
we
on
might
family
learn.
level, community level, national level. One of the things that I learned when I was first having all this introduced to me by one of my mentors was just the whole notion that blame, whether I'm blaming someone else or myself, is clearly an abdication of responsibility.
Right.
And a lot of times people even think that there's a connection between blame and responsibility, and what we suggest is it's just the opposite.
Uh-huh.
Blame is not responsibility.
Yeah,
The two
yeah.
things are very distinctly different.
Isn't that interesting? Because you think with blame, you're trying to find out who is responsible. You're hunting for the responsible party.
That's the myth, at least.
That's the myth. We'll get to the bottom of this.
Right.
Getting out of the blame game, as you're saying, is just accepting, well, I'm involved somehow, so I have a responsibility here.
Yeah, starting to look at what role could I have played, what could I have done differently, and if I'm the one who directly, created the situation, again, wow, that didn't go well. What do I want to learn from this so we don't repeat the mistake?
Well, let me ask you what I actually assume is a pretty hard question. Given the culture of CYA, cover your ass,
Right.
how do you deal with this? I mean, not everybody is going to respond the same way to the idea of trading responsibility for blame. How do you work that with teams?
Well, with teams or coaching executives and so on, part of it is, asking a simple question, somewhat humorously, and that is, so how did that turn out? Well, it turned out terribly. So would you like to have that turn out that way again sometime soon? No, I wouldn't. All right, well then let's walk down a path to make sure that doesn't happen. Let's take ownership for our role in it and learn from it so we make sure we don't repeat it.
Well, I'm repeating now, I'm sure, because we've used this before, but Einstein said that insanity is doing the
Right.
same thing and expecting a different result. It's kind of like talking to somebody on the phone that you discover doesn't speak English, so you talk louder.
Yeah.
This is not ever going to work.
But it happens. We share this in the book, but I think for me, one of the most beautiful examples of this is I first started to learn this whole notion of how really toxic and ineffective the blame game is. And that it really, if you think about it, lowers our IQ.
Right.
Because we're unwilling to see the cause of the situation, the role we played in it, and what we could do different. So when I was running an entertainment company, we got really caught up with this idea of the blame game and decided to create a game show called The Blame Game.
Oh, I remember this story from the book. This is great.
Yeah, so
Painful, but good.
So the idea was it was set up as kind of a funny mock game show, and you'd win by being the most outrageous blamer. Right.
Great concept.
And the whole notion is that by calling this tendency out and making so much fun of it, that it would start to have people be more aware of it. So we had gotten ready to shoot a whole pilot. We were all ready to go. We'd done the initial run-throughs, and one of our writers also happened to be a writer on Saturday Night Live. And so, just in the course of having conversations with his writing mates at Saturday Night Live, they asked him what he was up to, and he shared with them this idea of the blame game. Well, they thought it was so funny that they actually beat us to the draw and did a parody.
So they stole the idea.
Yeah, of the blame game on Saturday Night Live.
Oh, my.
Well, for a whole bunch of reasons, it just killed our idea.
Well, I can see that. Yeah, did you find out when you saw it on
I
Saturday
found
Night?
out when I saw it,
Oh,
and
boy.
I was watching it just like, what?
How could they?
And then I got an email the very next morning from him. He was back in New York, going, "You may have seen Saturday Night Live."
Oh, boy.
So I take this into the team and I ask, "How many of you saw Saturday Night Live last night?" And everybody was like furious. How could he? How could they?
Right.
Because it basically scuttled our show, and we were like blaming him and all this kind of stuff. And
You're blaming him for leaking the story about the blame game.
Yeah,
I love
which
it.
was a show designed to have you not blame people.
I love this. That should have been filmed.
So my partner and I, my producing partner and I, it finally hit us. You know,
Yeah.
kind of the irony and
Was it actually a moment like an epiphany where you just suddenly got it?
it was. Everybody was really upset, and all of a sudden I stopped and he stopped, and we looked at each other and we started laughing.
Oh boy.
And everybody else was looking at us, and it was kind of one of those moments like when you're laughing and a dog isn't sure what that means. You know,
Right.
they were like, "What? Why are you laughing?" They were thinking, "Was this a joke?
Yeah.
Or was this part of it?"
Yeah.
And we went, "No, we're just realizing how ridiculous this is, that we've all gone into the blame game
About the blame
about
game.
the blame game."
That's too rich.
They didn't necessarily think it was as funny as we did, but, you know, great lesson. So the idea was, what we didn't do, well, we didn't have a non-disclosure, non-compete,
Exactly.
right? So,
So were you able to review the history of what had happened and put it together?
yeah, we put into place different policies, and especially with writers who were elsewhere engaged, we were very careful about, you know, making them promise that they wouldn't reveal our ideas to
Yeah.
their other writing
Yeah.
team.
Yeah.
But, you know,
What a
how
great
hilarious.
example. Well, I have a story. It's more personal, which is kind of the other side of this, an inspiring story for what happened. Way back in my 20s, I was up in Vancouver, and a number of us were starving, not starving artists, we were just starving. So we were sharing homes. And I lived for a while in this home with 3 or 4 other people. One day at dinner, this one woman spoke up, just enraged, pointing her finger at one of the other women and saying, "You left a ring in the bathtub. You did not clean up the bathtub. And I went in there and it was just disgusting. And I didn't even have a bath. I just left it as it is. It's still in there dirty." And this woman just listened and then said, "Mm." And she went and she cleaned it up, which took her all of like 15 minutes. Well, a week or 2 later, we learned that she wasn't the one who'd done that.
Oh, wow, interesting.
It was someone else. But she didn't get defensive being confronted with this blame. She just decided, I talked to her about it. She said, "Well, you know, the tub was dirty. I figured I could fix it. It was easier than having a fight." And when the
Wow.
other woman learned about that, I think it's fair to say that changed her life around the blame game.
Wow.
Because here this person who was being blamed falsely, she had no part in the thing at all, just quietly took care of what was needed.
You know, it's interesting that she decided to learn from that, because she could have just as easily, had she wanted to continue the episodic, have just as easily gone, "I can't believe you didn't tell me, that you let me think that was you, and you went ahead and did it. You made me look like a fool."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, she could have. So the point you're raising, which I think is noteworthy, is that at any time we can change channels.
Well, and that's the thing that for me, when I first realized this, was that they say it takes 2 to tango, or tangle, if we're talking about a conflict, and just one person can change the dance.
Exactly.
And so if you or I are involved in a situation and we elect to take a different course and change the dance, it at least provides the other person the opportunity to change as well. But we can, as your friend did, and that's just remarkable what she did. I mean, wow. You know, if we take that path, basically she was choosing peace over conflict.
Exactly.
Because it clearly wasn't something that rose to a high enough level
Right.
of importance for her to think that it was worth going to battle about.
Well, exactly. And I'm remembering a TV show years ago with Dr. Joe Holton, a chiropractor in Toronto. And he was on this show where the host was famous for being really kind of nasty and finding the weak point and kind of probing. And so I watched this video, and so Dr. Joe Holton, his big thing was humor. He felt that humor was healthy and you should try and, laugh at things. So the host was prepared. And he proceeded to give Joe one scenario after another where, "Oh, you just got a car and you go out to get your car and it's been keyed. It's just destroyed. You're so proud of that car. Now it's just wrecked." And Joe said, "Well, insurance will cover it and I'll get a brand new car." And the host went, "Oh, okay. Well, how about this?" And he just kept hitting him with one example of it after another and blaming someone for the misfortune. Joe just kept responding with a joke. He said, "Well, the kid drew on the new paint in the house. Well, you can make a mural out of it." He just kept looking on the bright side, refusing to join in the blame game. At the end, this interviewer kind of turned and said, "Well, this has really been fascinating. And thank you." And I get it. And all his viewers were shocked that this guy's heart kind of melted in the face of this unrelenting attack of good humor.
That's remarkable. So I mean, basically won over the hard-nosed
Yeah.
interviewer.
Yeah.
Well, as we were thinking about this, I thought about, there's a lot of talk about positivity where it can go too far to where we ignore something important that's going on. And so we want to make clear that that's not what we're suggesting.
Exactly.
We've talked about assessment in previous programs, that it's really important to understand what is really going on. So clearly that, and part of taking ownership is understanding what's really going on, but then deciding, let's take ownership and see what we can turn this into.
Well, exactly. And we've talked, I think, kind of exhaustively on the show and in the book we write about the relationship between the way things are and the way you'd like them to be. So we're not preaching denial in any way, shape, or form. We need to face what's happening. However, we can choose our choices and what we want to create instead.
Well, and as we think about that, in our book we have what we call the power scale.
Love this.
And it's a 0 to 10 scale, and on each side of the continuum are 10 possible behaviors or actions. And so just walking through them, just to give you a feel for it, on the victim or surviving side of the scale, I blame. On the empowered or thriving side of the scale, I take ownership.
And on the victim side, I've got all kinds of excuses, whereas over on the thriving side, it's about the lessons I've learned.
Right. And on the victim and surviving side, I'm reactive. And on the thriving side or the empowered side, I'm proactive.
And over on the victim surviving side, we've got bias cycles prevailing. And on the empowered thriving side, inclusive views.
On the victim or surviving side, I become very problem-centric. And we were just talking about this a moment ago. On the empowered or thriving side, I become solution-centric.
And over on the victim surviving side, I'm pessimistic, versus on the empowered thriving side, what we call healthy optimism, which is really realism.
Yeah, well, and it's what we were just talking about, assessing what's really going on and then deciding what we want to do about it and holding a positive outcome in our mind of what's possible. On the surviving victim side, kind of constricted views, my way or the highway, or it's always been done this way.
If I want your opinion, I'll give it to you.
Right. On the empowered, thriving side, expanded awareness, where we're really starting to try to understand beyond our own limited viewpoint.
And back on the victim surviving side, we're very keen to point out what's wrong. Those dread words. Have you got a minute? And you know what's coming. Versus on the healthy, empowered, thriving side, catching people doing something right. I love that.
Yeah, and it's such an effective tool for managers as well, is to catch people doing it right. On the victim or surviving side, that unhealthy competition where we actually start competing with our own team. We start competing where the only way I can win is if you lose. Mm-hmm. Where on the empowered, thriving side, it's really more of a healthy collaboration and cooperation where we're in it for each other as well as ourselves.
Yeah, and win-lose versus win-win-win. Talk about why there's three. What are the three wins there?
Well, so win-win-win is really based off from certain ecological mindset around human dynamics. It would mean that what I'm doing is good for me, it's good for you, and it's good for all of those who will be involved. Mm-hmm. So we're looking to, how can we create a situation where no one loses?
Right.
Now that presents a challenge, and it really takes us beyond the mindset of, win-lose or competition, zero-sum game, and so forth. And when I've worked with teams around that win-win-win, or another way to say it is, there is no them.
Right.
It's all us.
Right.
We start to think about things and a lot of times create real innovative breakthroughs, new inventive ways of doing things when we try to figure out how can we do this so that it's good for everybody.
Well, and it's really healthy and extremely practical to start with an acknowledgement that all of us are surviving in some areas, we're thriving in others. I mentioned this at the start of a presentation I did the other night where I've been invited to sketch out some of our visionary principles. And I could tell when I said that people got it. Nobody is thriving 100%.
Yeah, it'd be
There's
great.
pockets. It would be terrific, and we're aiming for that, but there's pockets
Right.
where we're surviving or maybe even barely surviving. So the power scale, we need to see that as having a different score relative to different parts of our lives.
Yeah, that's
Correct?
important to notice that. Absolutely. And I think it is helpful, and to realize that a lot of times, we're in a surviving state of mind and in a particular area, and that just by looking at that power scale and saying, well, what would I do if I move to ownership? There's 4 questions that we've used to help people with this. And as you walk through it, it's, the first one is, what is the outcome or solution that I or we truly want or need?
And I love the second one here. What can I or we do to create that outcome?
Right. Yeah, so you can see we're assessing.
Yeah.
And then we're creating a vision or goal, and then
Yeah.
we're saying, what is the action? The third one is, who and what resources do I or we need to involve or access?
Well, and that's where the inclusivity comes in, just reaching out to include. And then the final one, what can I or we do about the elements that seem beyond our control? Where, with whom do I or we have influence? Boy, that's a big one.
Yeah. Well, and I've worked with a lot of teams where they go, well, that's beyond our control. We can't control that. And it's true. So the first question is, well, what can you control?
Right.
Obviously, we can control our attitude. We can control how, we deal with it or approach it. But the other question that so often doesn't get looked at is, who do I know that has influence? Or who do I know that has influence on somebody who has influence?
Mm-hmm.
So it's, they're used to say 7 degrees of separation,
Yep.
right? It was a game that if you asked, you'd find that within 7 degrees, someone knew Kevin Bacon.
Right.
And I always loved that game because I have a
So
friend.
did Kevin Bacon. He
Sure
got
did.
huge name recognition through that.
TVQ went way up. Yeah, I knew someone who knew him, so I was just 2 degrees from
Right.
Kevin Bacon. Well, now with the internet and social media and social networks, the research that's been done is that basically we're all only 3 degrees from anyone in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So when you
Isn't that
start to
amazing?
say, yeah, who do I know who has influence on somebody who has control? It's right within our reach.
And here's the paradox. We've got so many heroic tales featuring the lone ranger who, wins with muscle and brains. And yet, we love doing things together. And now that's reflecting in stories where the superheroes are forming alliances, the Justice League, and these guys get together and they help each other. I think that's a sign of evolution in our species, where we're actually becoming conscious that, hey, we need each other.
Well, absolutely. We need each other. We need the environment. We need, so much to really be able to make the changes we need in the world. So one of the things we just want to invite our listeners to do this week is start to think about adopting a mindset of empowerment, of powering up.
Right, and we like to make this a stretch, so you might select something. Some area where you're playing the blame game. You're convinced it's somebody else's fault for what's going on. Try this out, just accepting ownership, being responsible yourself, and see what happens.
Yeah, and especially, you mentioned this in the blog, and I thought it was a great example, is that a lot of times when you see somebody else who's kind of had something go wrong, rather than heaping on the blame, to really, sidle up next to them and say, hey, sorry that happened. What can I do to help you?
Well, we've all screwed up, and we know we feel bad about it. We don't have to pile on. All right, we're out of time. This is Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding. You can reach us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. And thanks to everybody throughout South America who's tuned in this last week. My goodness, we had just an amazing group, so much appreciated.
Great, we'll talk to you again next week.